Imagine you're at home. You're walking on carpet, heading to the kitchen. You microwave a bag of popcorn for a little snack. You check the weather on your phone. It's sunny right now, but may rain later on, so you pack your sunscreen, take a rain jacket, and head out the door. At every step of what I just described, from the carpet to the popcorn to the smartphone, sunscreen, rain jacket, you may have come into contact with what are called forever chemicals. They're useful, but also pose a problem, and have for decades.
I think we're dealing with a worldwide public health threat here.
So for the first time ever, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is pushing to remove 6 types of these chemicals from U.S. drinking water. It's also designating 2 of them as hazardous substances, which will force those who make them and sell them to clean them up.
This is a consequential, historic, monumental decision from the EPA.
So now that the U.S. is making a move, we wanted to know, will Canada follow suit? These forever chemicals first popped up back in the 1940s as the non-stick in our non-stick pans.
Even burned food won't stick to Teflon, so it's always easy to clean.
They're technically called per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. Now, don't worry, the exact molecular structure doesn't matter so much. It's carbon and fluorine atoms attached to each other. But you do need to know the way they attach. It's one of the strongest chemical bonds we know of. That makes them exceptionally good at repelling things like water, grease, dirt. So for decades, they were used in essentially anything waterproof or stain resistant. Food wrappers, you remember the popcorn bag? Furniture, artificial turf, paper plates. But that molecular bond that makes PFAS so resilient and so practical is also part of the problem.
Combining those 2 atoms in that way creates a chemical backbone that is very difficult to break apart. So when it gets out into the world, it doesn't break down naturally. That's why you hear these chemicals being referred to as forever chemicals.
Once PFAS makes their way into the environment, they're pretty much there for good. They don't biodegrade. They don't break down in the sun. They don't dissolve. They don't oxidize. You can't digest them. So they find their way into almost everything, in nearly every species of fish, in raindrops falling all the way out in Tibet and Antarctica, and in almost half of the public drinking water systems in the United States.
Not only do they stay there, they've got all these potential toxic effects. So they're almost like, it's like a ticking time bomb.
The earliest signs these chemicals were dangerous appeared very publicly in the early 90s when a group of people living near a Teflon plant in the US started noticing all kinds of weird symptoms and health problems. They made a whole documentary about it called The Devil We Know.
A friend of ours talked about granddaughter's teeth turning black and they couldn't understand it. Then looked over and there's my neighbor's dog's tumors all over him. He couldn't explain. He said, I've never seen the like.
Eventually, they came to suspect it was PFAS leaching into their soil and water. So they launched a class action suit against the company, DuPont. And DuPont was forced to turn over all of their internal reporting on this chemical safety. That's when the public and the media started paying attention.
In 1981, 3M found ingestion of PFAS caused birth defects in rats. And when they told DuPont about this, and DuPont then tested the children of employees in their Teflon division, they found that of 7 births, 2 had eye defects. Information that, interestingly, DuPont did not make public.
Those revelations were pretty damning. But the company said, okay, look, these studies involved animals and people exposed to extremely high levels of PFAS. They don't prove we caused all of these issues in the community. But they agreed as part of their settlement to help look into these health concerns. And more than 70,000 people in that community agreed to have their blood tested over the next 7 years. The results were unambiguous.
Exposure to the toxic chemical PFOA, which is also known as C8, has been linked with probability to 6 diseases, including 2 forms of cancer and ulcerative colitis.
We were able to finally confirm what we have been seeing in those internal documents, that these chemicals were linked with a wide variety of different adverse health effects.
Over the next couple of decades, more and more studies came out, confirming and building on those findings. And a scientific consensus began to form that PFAS chemicals were linked to an alarming number of health problems: cancer, liver damage, kidney damage, cardiovascular diseases, obesity, diabetes, immune system dysfunction, pregnancy-induced hypertension, and preeclampsia, and low birth weight. Now, not everybody lives beside a Teflon plant, but given enough time, the worry is that a person may not need to, for the health risks of PFAS chemicals to start adding up. Here's how one chemical engineer put it to US Congress a few years back.
This is a man-made chemical. We just pass the baton to our generations of kids. In fact, if you were to incinerate and cremate me, I would technically be a fluorochemical hazardous source. The Teflon mesh that's used in my hernia produces a very toxic gas. You can't kill this beast. You can only control it.
Since 2016, the three most common types of PFAS have been banned from being manufactured, imported, sold, and used in Canada. But because of how long these things stick around, decades, possibly centuries, in many cases, they're still lingering in our soil, our dust, our air, and our bodies. A 2017 study by Health Canada found 99% of Canadians they studied had PFAS in their blood. And I'll say that again. Virtually everybody has PFAS chemicals in their blood. And even though some of them are now banned, many are still used.
PFAS firefighting foams have this property of, especially, when you have petroleum spills and the fires over the petroleum spill, it's easy for the PFAS foam to cover it and sort of control that fire there.
According to Canada's Environmental Protection Act, in Canada, a major point source of PFAS contamination is the use of firefighting foams to extinguish fuel fires, or in the conduct of firefighting training and testing activities. That includes airports, which up until 2019 exclusively used a foam with PFAS called aqueous film-forming foam. Some, like Toronto's Pearson Airport and the Ottawa Airport, have since started phasing it out, but many still use it. And one study estimated there could be as many as 420 airports contaminated with PFAS across the country. Military bases are another problem. The Department of National Defense says there are at least 26 military properties where PFAS contamination is either suspected or confirmed.
So for decades, firefighters, military personnel have been using this foam, spraying it all over, having no idea that it had these PFAS chemicals.
North Bay is a fantastic example of that. They found that their local creek was contaminated with PFAS, and that the major source was probably from the military base in that region.
In all, there are hundreds of sites across the country that Environment and Climate Change Canada says are contaminated with high levels of PFAS. Experts say, just like that community in West Virginia, people living near these Canadian sites are at a high risk of exposure. And it gets worse. Every time these chemicals are released into the environment, they inevitably seep into the groundwater and nearby waterways. And once that happens, it's not long before it gets into what you drink.
Because there is no possibility to degrade them in the environment. And so they are always there in the water body.
Now, there hasn't been all that much research into PFAS in Canadian drinking water, but the studies we do have suggest it's pretty widespread. In Ontario, between 2012 and 2016, the government tested 25 drinking water systems in the province for 14 different kinds of PFAS. They found 4 different ones in at least half of the samples they tested. PFOA, the one used in Teflon, was in 73% of samples. A more recent study found over 99% of 463 tap water samples in Quebec tested positive for PFAS. Now, Canada already has some guidelines when it comes to PFAS levels in drinking water. Those recommend a maximum concentration level for 2 different types, PFOA and PFOS. Those limits, though, are extremely high, hundreds of nanograms per liter, compare that to the US rule the EPA just put in place, which is 4 nanograms per liter. And recent research shows there's essentially no safe level of some PFAS exposure.
And so to be continuing to allow hundreds of parts per trillion or more simply isn't consistent with the science that exists.
Now, Canada is looking into bringing those levels down. Last spring, the federal government published a draft proposal recommending a limit of 30 nanograms per liter on the overall level of all PFAS chemicals in drinking water, which is a slightly different approach than the US decided to take. Instead of focusing on a handful of well-known PFAS chemicals and getting those levels down to near zero, they are considering activities that would address PFAS as a class rather than as individual substances. That's because there are thousands of these chemicals, and new ones just kind of keep popping up. For example, DuPont recently replaced PFOA with another very similar chemical compound known as Gen X. That's now used in all kinds of industries, from aerospace to electronics. But it's also been linked to many of the exact same health problems.
It's like the whole, whack-a-mole game. What's next? Where are we seeing it?
So the advantage to the Canadian plan is that they're trying to tackle every type of PFAS at the same time. But the experts we spoke to say that 30 nanogram limit is well above what they consider safe. The US, on the other hand, is hyper-focused on 6 specific PFAS chemicals. Their limit is low, and their goal, they say, is to get these levels down to 0. The problem, though, is there's nothing really stopping manufacturers from coming up with new chemicals to replace the 6 that are being banned. And the utilities companies have until 2029 to figure out how to monitor and remove them all from the drinking water. As for the timeline in Canada, the analysts we spoke to said they expect a change in guidelines sometime this year.